And welcome to the Business News Wales Weekly Business Review with me, Carwyn Jones, looking at all the issues that have affected Welsh business over the past 7 days. As ever, I'm joined by three guests in today's podcast, and it's good to welcome back Frank Holmes. Frank is the founding partner of Gambit Corporate Finance. Frank, it's good to see you back.
It's always a pleasure, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. And of course, Rhian Elston, good to see you again. Rhian is the Investment Director at the Development Bank of Wales.
Nice to see you again, Carwyn.
And Andrew Diplock as well. Andrew is an angel investor. That's the description he goes by. He is rather more than that. The description perhaps doesn't do him justice, but Andrew, good to have you back as well.
Okay, diolch yn fawr, Carwyn.
So, well, a warm welcome back to all three of you. And well, there's been one issue that we've been discussing over the past 9 months in Wales, and that's the issue of COVID. But what we've been trying to do is to look at the future. We know that there's a vaccine coming. We know it probably be at the very earliest late spring before things start to move to something close to normal. We've seen the effect on the economy. It's said that it's the most difficult recession for 300 years. We've got Brexit coming as well. But what we've tried to do is to try to look ahead to see what future opportunities might be there and where various guests see those opportunities developing in the future in Wales and beyond. And today, what I'd like to focus on is the investment landscape for 2021. There are a lot of things we can't predict, but we have three guests here who are experts in this field. And so, Frank, if I could start with you as somebody, obviously with a great deal of experience in trying to predict the future as well, if I can put it that way, given the investment climate we have at the moment. Next year, let's look at post-vaccine, when things might start to get to something close to normal. Where do you see the investment landscape improving in the year to come?
I have to say, if I look back now, December, and you'd asked me this question in March when we went into lockdown, I would have had an extremely negative perspective on the investment horizon. Here we are 9 months later, or 8.5 months later, and actually investments have been made, and quite significant investments across a range of sectors from a number of different funding sources and investor pool. So it hasn't actually been as bad as I would have anticipated. And I look on my own business, and we've just finished our year end and how we've turned out. But looking forward, I also look at the sort of things that we expect to be working on next year. And I guess it's quite a range. The nature of transactions will change. Valuations are having a bit of a difficult time in certain sectors particularly. And of course, businesses have suffered and their profitability has suffered. And the question really will be, how long will it take for them to get back to the sort of levels of activity and the sort of levels of profitability to make them attractive propositions, or to enable them to raise the required funding to pursue other sort of growth opportunities. So there have been winners and losers, and there always is in life and in business. I do see certain sectors doing very well next year, particularly in the technology fields of digital, medical devices, etc. But we still have those major industrial challenges that we face as a nation. Aging population will be a driver of activity. I'm absolutely convinced of that. The strive to net zero, renewables, areas of green energy, looking at different ways of decarbonization, I think will attract investment. And the reality is that there is a huge amount of funding available in the investment world at the moment, whether it be from significant private equity investors, family offices, investment banks. There is still a lot of money looking for a home. Closer to the banking world, of course, a lot of the banks have been diverted, if you like, in supporting their existing customers with CBILS and all of these other initiatives. So I think we'll see the banks coming back into the mainstream and hopefully trying to pick up where some of the challenges have really made a lot of a lot of hay whilst the banks were distracted with the government initiatives.
From your perspective, as somebody who perhaps sees potential investments coming in, looking at it from the other side, what are you seeing in terms of the trend for the coming year?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, I'd echo some of the things that Frank said. I mean, we've had an extremely busy year. When I look at where we are at the moment, we're about 15-16% up on the investments that we made this time last year. And that's excluding the sort of 100 million support that we put out as part of the COVID response. So if you like, business as usual in terms of investment is up, which I would never have thought would have been the position if you took me back to when lockdown first kicked in. I think what's interesting with us is where we sit. So Development Bank is there providing the gap funding. So I think when we're busy, you have to look at the impact of both supply and demand. So are we getting busier because there's less supply of funding out in the marketplace, or are we getting busier because demand is increasing? And more often than not, it's a combination of both. I think on the supply side, we've certainly seen some immediate tightening of private sector's appetite. Where we saw it first was in the property development side of things. So we saw the banks pulling back from property development quite quickly, and we really had to ramp up our activity in that area. But I think going forward into next year, you know, banks are going to be in an interesting position. They will have moved away from the bounce back and the C-bills, but they will have big portfolios of companies that perhaps have got high levels of debt, and they're going to need to put their attention to those companies as well. And we certainly anecdotally see an evidence of that now, where banks are focusing on existing customers rather than looking out for new business. I think the demand side on our side has kept up, you know, people looking for investment, for growth opportunities, for working capital, sharp increase in applications for startups, which probably don't surprise you that we've seen coming through. And the one thing for me that I would like to see for next year is hopefully more opportunities for equity investment. You know, Frank's mentioned it in terms of the tech space, but I think for us, it's always been a challenge for us to encourage companies to consider equity investment as a way forward. I would hope that we can move that conversation on now, because companies don't have perhaps as easy access to debt finance as what we have done previously, and there could be good opportunities for equity investments going forward. The challenge for us there is we need to co-invest with other equity providers, which may be a nice link to perhaps what Andrew could talk about on the angel side, as well as other institutional equity providers out there.
There we are, Andrew. A queue has been set up for you. I would say to you, where would you put your money next year? And that's literally the case as far as you're concerned. Well, we've heard both from Frank and from Rhian an upbeat assessment of what's happened this year. Are you seeing that as well, and how do you see that playing into the year to come?
Yeah, thanks, Carwyn. Yeah, I think, you know, again, I'd echo what Frank and Rhian just said, really. It was quite interesting, actually. There's some stats available now, and British Business Bank, I think, have come out and, you know, and reported on angel investment activity. And, you know, it was quite surprising, I suppose. You know, there's been a lot of activity, you know, since March, and that's good to see. And I guess more importantly, looking forward, you know, there's quite a high proportion of angel investors, you know, putting their personal money in, that are very confident about the future as well, you know, despite the problems, the ongoing problems of COVID and clearly Brexit on the horizon as well. So I think, you know, I think it is a positive landscape out there. There's you know, in my experience, and I know Rhian sees the same, there is not a shortage of opportunities, you know, to invest. I think angel investors such as myself, you know, we're quite selective, and everybody has their own drivers, I suppose, in what we're looking for. And the development bank, you know, in this part of the world plays a, you know, a really important role, really, to leverage private capital in order to support those early stage businesses.
Thanks for that. There are two sectors I want to look at in particular to get your views on their future. A little later on, I'll ask you your views on retail. But for our first topic, I'd like to look at commercial property development, particularly when it comes to office space. Now, there are some who take the view that the demand will go down because there'll be more home working. It won't completely replace being in the office, I suspect. Others have said, well, no, the demand will be there, but it might take a different form. There will be a demand for smaller offices rather than whole floors, if I can put it that way. Now, I'm interested really in your take on this, because I'm not sure we've got a clear picture from practitioners like yourselves, if I can put it that way, as to what you think the demand for commercial property will be in the future, what it'll look like, particularly. Frank, if I could come to you first, what have you seen this year? And what sort of, again, when we look at next year, do you see demand changing? Or if not, do you see the nature of that demand changing?
I think if I reflect back on a survey that we conducted around about June time, when we talked to companies ranging from sort of 5 million turnover all the way up to over 1 billion, and this question came up, and I don't think the sentiment then has changed significantly, and that was that most occupiers of commercial property at that point in time would be reviewing their requirements going forward. They'd learnt already within a very short space of time that they probably didn't need as much space as they had, and how could they actually make that work better for them, particularly those with commitments that were pretty difficult to unravel. So I think, and of course, companies that were looking to move into new premises were probably reassessing what their requirements were going to be. So there's undoubtedly going to be an impact. I mean, the sheer fact that we're having this podcast as we are, and we've all been working for the last 6-7 months in the way that we have, really dictates that we can work in different ways and just as effectively. In fact, one would argue more intensely. It seems that way, certainly. But to answer your question, I think, city centres will need to reinvent themselves and reimagine how some of those buildings are sort of used and dedicated. Even some of the retail units are going to have to be revisited in terms of what they actually end up doing. And as I said earlier, we have got an aging population issue. So you can imagine commercial buildings being used in different ways to accommodate that significant element of our population in terms of retirement homes and so forth. And I'm certainly seeing that in the market, and bringing those closer into cities where there is still a bit of liveliness, because that is what these developers are looking for, where there's a bit of activity for their sort of customer bases. So I think we'll see office space being questioned, but there is always room for the high grade. There was always going to be demand for the top level of office space accommodation. I don't see that changing. What I do see happening is that places like Cardiff and Newport, Swansea, hopefully, will benefit from migration, with some of the companies moving out of London into cheaper alternative property accommodation, where they can actually operate with significantly reduced overhead costs.
Thanks, Frank. From your perspective, are you seeing any changes in the kind of office space that's being demanded? Are we seeing a larger number of smaller businesses looking for smaller spaces? Are we seeing, as some have suggested, the bigger tenants saying, well, actually, we don't need 2 floors or 3 floors. We can make do with 1 floor. Most people might, work at home some of the week. We don't need as much space. I mean, is that that's an assumption, but is that something that's being seen in reality?
I think absolutely. I can talk personally from what development bankers look to do. Even before COVID, we were looking at the space that we took and trying to understand if we could work more flexibly for lots of different reasons, not just in terms of taking into consideration how much space we use there, but also in terms of benefits of attracting new employees by offering flexible working benefits. And as Frank said, often you can work more productively if you offer individuals the opportunity to do the work in the place that best suits them. So I think it's inevitable. Companies were already thinking about that pre-COVID, and COVID has just made people realize that it is possible. We run a commercial property fund. So, you know, we are still receiving applications in from developers that are looking to develop commercial property. But what I would say there is commercial property is vast. You know, that is covering industrial units as well as office blocks. So, you know, there's a big spectrum within that. And I think what we've had in Wales, certainly in certain areas, is a big issue with supply. So I think Wales in certain areas has still got space to continue to build commercial properties because there was such demand in an area that wasn't fully supplied previously. I mean, to give you an example, we recently looked at one in Wrexham Industrial Estate, where if they build a unit there, they will be occupied. There's such demand in that area. And I'd also echo Frank's last point around if you build quality, then I think there will still be demand for that. And we've looked at a few applications where, particularly again in cities where perhaps there's been underinvestment to date, so there might be a number of existing office blocks, but they're older quality. If you're coming in at that top end and offering good quality, flexible working spaces, then I think there's still the demand there.
Okay, thanks for that. Andrew, do you need these days a lot of space for an office? That's the big question, isn't it? We've heard from Frank and from Rhian that demand is there. Perhaps it might change, but what will the commercial property sector look like, do you think, over the next few years compared to where it's been?
Yeah, I think to answer, your question directly, I think that there's always going to be a place for the office. People need to interact with people, so that will have a place. But I think, I think like Rhian, really, before COVID, people have got used to working at home, and the flexibility that offers. And especially if I can speak, I work with a lot of startups, and the flexibility that sort of gives, the founders to balance their kind of lifestyle, with the challenges of growing a business means that, the home working environment will continue, really. I think, in terms of looking forward, one of the key aspects is to have flexible office space. I've got one of the businesses that I've invested in Caerphilly. One of the key criteria for the unit and office that they occupy is the flexibility the landlord offers in terms of the lease. It's not a commitment for a long period, and it allows that business then to both manage risk, but also sort of look forward and maybe if it outgrows that premises, it doesn't have the burden of having an entrenched lease, that ties it down to the one location, really. So I think it's about flexibility and that kind of co-working space when it comes to sort of even more embryonic business that will see good growth in the years ahead, really.
Thanks, everybody. Let's turn to retail, but expand it a bit, because I'm going to come to Frank first, because I think, Frank, you mentioned the reimagining of the city or town centre. I'm from Bridgend, you know Bridgend. Significant drop in retail premises occupancy over the past 9 months, really. It was difficult before that. A noticeable increase in the number of bars and restaurants. And despite the fact there's some very good office accommodation, it probably needs a bit more actually to create the footfall that the town needs. We've talked a lot in the past about the need for town centres to reimagine themselves. I was in St David's 2 last week, and again, even St David's 2, which is very busy, noticeable amount of space at the moment that's available for a retailer. What does the town centre or city centre of the future look like? You made reference there to reimagining buildings so that they become, for example, good, safe homes for older people that are in the town centre, not isolated. What do we get if we look back at this program in 10 years' time? This podcast in 10 years' time. What will we be thinking of in terms of how we'd want city and town centres to develop?
That's one hell of a question. I'll do my best. Use my imagination.
Are we looking at fewer shops, more restaurants, more offices, for example?
Yes, I mean, I think the retail point is well made, because we've seen cataclysmic retail collapses in the last few weeks. From Arcadia to Debenhams and you know, Bon Marché, etc. The Edinburgh Woolen Mill Group, you know, and it hasn't come to an end. And of course, what that signals is that the way we are buying a lot of our retail requirements has changed dramatically, and I can't see that going back. So the internet has enabled the providers of many of the things that we need, clothing, food, and so forth, to be supplied in a very different way, and created another industry, which is a sort of last mile van and distribution centers, as you know, with Amazon and others setting up big warehouses. So if I try and imagine a city center, and I can see that, you know, more sort of hospitality. I completely get that, because these units will bring people together, and people do like getting together, as we all know. But I can see opportunities for alternative use accommodation. I mean, there are a lot of pubs that are going to struggle to survive through the, you know, the repetitive closures that they've gone through, the inability to sustain themselves through this difficult time. So I can certainly see alternative use as pubs come, and certainly being turned into accommodation in different ways for different elements of our citizenship. I do think that it would be good to enable older people to find accommodation in cities where they felt they could have communal, you know, arrangements, meet people, because as we all know, one of the worst things about age, and probably the biggest killer of age, is loneliness. So, you know, a move towards bringing that element of our population, you know, closer into the areas where there's more activity, I think is a good thing. Entertainment, hospitality, I think that would probably be the biggest draw. And you will find, you know, that the pub kind of world will change. You'll have these microbreweries setting up and so forth. So, you know, they will reinvent themselves. There's no doubt about that. That's one good thing that we can all look forward to. But as to being exactly precise what that looks like, that's a big ask.
That's right. Rhian, from your perspective, is there anything that you see from the bank's perspective that represents a trend in terms of what's happening in town and city centres? You know, I live in Bridgend. You would not fail to get a haircut because you can't get that online. You know, restaurants, pubs, fine, no problem. Almost as if whatever you can't get online, it seems to work in a town and city centre, but increasingly more difficult if you're competing with an online provider. I mean, what are you seeing from your perspective?
You know, I think you're absolutely right on that front. I mean, that has been evident to everybody since lockdown. Everybody is far more comfortable in purchasing online than what we were before. We've been doing it long enough now that this is a habit. This is what it is going to be going forward. So I think, you know, retail businesses have needed to adapt to that new normal and that new way of working. So we've seen, but, you know, we've seen successes of that. We've seen retail companies adapting to that new way, and maybe that is launching the online part of their business or turn into delivery if they're hospitality, rather than just sort of continuing doing what they were doing previously. I think it's difficult to identify trends sort of this early. I think what could be interesting going forward is whether you see more of these combined use spaces popping up in city centres, where you have got combination of places to live, places to buy, places to work as a more combined offering. I think that would be quite interesting to see how much that develops. And the other point I was going to mention was around how perhaps we can be a bit more innovative and a bit more joined up in terms of how we use some of the empty space that would be in city centres and town centres. So, you know, I'm quite interested in other schemes elsewhere where councils have been working very closely with startups, as an example, allowing startups to use premises that would otherwise be empty, so that they can test their new business model and allow them a period of doing that, because, you know, surely that is a lot better than just having an empty top front, not really adding anything to the local community. So I think, you know, that involves joint up thinking between the local authority, the landlord, and the startup community. But I think, you know, they're positive moves as to how we can use the space better.
Yeah, one of the problems, although I think it's a bit easier now, is that certainly people have said to me, well, you know, we'd like to have a shop, but we're being told you need to have a 10-year lease, maybe with a 5-year break. That's never going to happen in this day and age. That's changing. I mean, we are seeing more and more pop-up shops now, which I think is useful. Well, Andrew, would you invest in retail at the moment? Again, what's the future as far as you're concerned for town and city centres? Where getting the balance right is going to be important, but where does the balance lie between the offices that create the footfall for the restaurants and the retail businesses?
Well, to answer your first question, no, I don't invest in retail. Not my speciality at all, really. But I think, you know, it's a disadvantage of going third. I think I'll echo again, you know, what Frank and Rhian said. You know, I think the point is, isn't it? You've got to have more reasons for people to be on the high street. You know, there's got to be that blended approach, I suppose, or the hybrid approach that that's been mentioned already, you know, in essence. And I think the flexibility of offering, you mentioned around, you know, landlords being more flexible and more innovative in terms of their approach to try and sort of attract, you know, the different mixed uses, and, you know, be that accommodation or offices or retail or hospitality is the way forward, you know, in essence. I think, you know, one of the bigger challenges maybe we've got in Wales is to not just think this as a, you know, as a city centre, you know, problem, you know, in terms of Cardiff or Newport or Swansea, but you know, those towns, you know, maybe in the valleys, you know, that, you know, have more, you know, more issues, you know, around, you know, the how thriving that sort of main street is, and how to attract the right people to the right places.
Well, time is against us, but just, I mean, from my perspective, one of the moans I always have is there are very few places you can buy clothes if you're my age and my size. If there are 2 words in the English language I would like to ban, I'm fairly liberal in that sense, and they would be slim fit. That ship sailed a long time ago, but there we are. We can't resolve the issue of the men's clothing industry in space of the minute that we have. It has been my very real pleasure to have you all on. Again, time has gone very quickly, and we've dealt with a lot of issues in a short space of time. But Frank, Rhian, Andrew, once again, very good to have you on. If I don't see you before Christmas, have a good Christmas and a peaceful new year. Let's hope that we all see a change for the better in the year to come. You've been listening to me, Carwyn Jones, on the Business News Wales Weekly Business Review. Join me again in a week's time, where we look at all the issues that have affected business in Wales over the previous week. And in the meantime, keep safe.